So 2 months ago, as you may remember, I did a demo on painting, basic panel fading and tank painting. So I said, so this month, or this time around, was the main point of the reason I offered to do volunteer some demos was a lot of people asked me about painting things in place, and little people were like, wow, I really can't imagine doing that. It seems kind of crazy. What are you talking about? So I thought I would spend a little time just going over painting things in place and all that. So this is the same vehicle I did last time, but it took a little further. I got home and I realized, wow, that's not all the colors I thought they were supposed to be. So I did a little color touch-up on it. Note to self, bring a light, bring the proper glasses. Very much different demo when I can see and it's bright enough. So anyway, this is the color scheme I want it to be. And I think I mentioned that this is the old paint mule that you guys have seen me do demos on for years and years. And
Thank you.
I've kind of refurbished it into a bit of a sci-fi looking project with one of the main goals was to see just how much stuff I could get on here so I could do this demo. So if it looks like it's a little overloaded, that's entirely so I can show you a few tips and tricks. So a couple of things to cover real quick is like why paint in place versus painting separately. For me, there's two reasons that I think are the most important. Number one is I think it's quite a bit faster once you get used to it. And the reason is you are only painting the stuff that you can see, and you're not painting the parts of the model or the parts of the stowage that are hidden. So that is actually a reasonably big deal for certain things. In particular, stowage is one, but another big one is tracks. So if you look at this model and you look at this tracks, these tracks have pads. These pads generally need to be painted some color. Usually like a dark gray is a typical choice. If you have the tracks separately, you have no real idea which pads are going to end up wherever. You're going to put them on eventually. Okay, so you paint every single pad, or you paint the whole track out. But in reality, as you can see, with the skirts and just literally sitting on the ground, there's really no point in painting the rubber pads down here or painting anything above the run. So you can end up painting just this little section and just this little section rubber pads. That's a lot less pads. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. With stowage, if you look at stowage boxes, packs, even ammo cans that are welded to the back, what you see is that you really can't find all the parts of it. Usually somewhere between half and 2/3 of a piece of stowage is visible. Well, if you paint the underside of the stowage and say this is a pack and say it has straps, you've done a lot more work that is now invisible. I don't really feel the need to do work on things that are invisible. In addition, the second main reason, which I also think is really important, is you get a lot stronger model if you glue things on when it's plastic on plastic, which is obviously great because you can use glue, Tamiya cement or whatever, that's real hard. But even if it's something that's like resin to plastic or resin to CA, resin to resin, you can lightly sand the resin and you can get a nice bite with the CA so it holds. But if you're going to go paint on paint, if you paint separately, very unlikely that it's going to be super strong and durable. It just isn't. It tends to be easy to break off. And you'll really see that in a lot of different ways. In particular places where you can really run into trouble with that, tracks. If you put your tracks on and you glue them with CA at the end, because they're all painted, it is so easy when you're moving your model and going to work on it, oh boink, I knocked it loose. These are just belted on, or you're going to put it on your base, that's happened, and you go to put it on the base with the mud and it snacks. It doesn't break free or anything, it just comes loose and doesn't sit right after that. So one of the reasons I like to paint a lot of stuff in place is it's nice and durable. The last reason, which is kind of related, is you can be a little more sure of all your alignment when you're doing it without the paint, because you're not, oh my God, I don't want to move it because the paint will come loose. Okay, it's glue. So you can get everything lined up really square and be pretty sure of it. So I find all these things are compelling reasons for me to paint in place. And to be honest, I started out painting everything separately, like probably all of us did. And what inspired me to paint in place was I was reading an article by a guy named Bob Calignan, who's a real nice guy. It was an article in Fine Scale, and he was building some kind of an old Sherman kit, I think the old Artillery 76 Sherman. And lo and behold, he puts all the stowage on it, and he puts all the tracks on it, and he paints everything as one big shot. And his model is like, oh my God, this thing is a piece of art. It looks fantastic. And of course, then I'm like, well, I could never do that, but I'll try the stowage. And as the years went by, I kept saying, well, I could never do that, but I'm going to try this one. And eventually I realized I could actually do that. And other things would force the situation, like I never really painted tracks in place until I tried to build Tamiya's JS2, which comes with a jig. And so the only real way you can get the tracks in place is to glue them ahead of time. So you're like, well, I'm going to have to paint these in place. And then you went, that was actually really easy. I should have been doing this a long time ago. So that's kind of how I got there. So I would encourage all of you to try painting more things in place to your level of comfort and decide what works, or just go all in on a model and say, I'm going to chance it one time and see what happens. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, no big deal. It's one model.
So for like instance, axes or shovels that are on like
I'm going to demonstrate that right here.
Okay, how do you get the underside?
You don't. Can't see it.
Really? So even...
I'll talk about all that.
Okay.
So what don't I paint in place? That's a good question, because I don't paint everything in place all the time. Certain things are more obviously easier to paint that's not in place. For example, big ice chests you see on vehicles modern day, big old igloo coolers. Like there's going to be one that sits, I think it sits like right here or something like that. You know what? I really don't feel a need to paint that in place. It's red, it's white. That's going to be a first-rate pain in the neck to paint. I'd have to mask it. And in fact, you can see that this one down here, I had to mask the daylights out of that to get that painted. Now, I painted it in place because I wanted to make sure that I could lay some other stuff on top of it, and I regretted it because I should have left separate. Other things I don't paint in place, things with antennas. If you remember last time, there's a big APU system here with a bunch of antenna gear that stick out. This is another unit that has antennas. Easier to keep antennas off because they don't break until you go to paint something else and oh crap, and they get broken off. So those things are good to leave off. These are big Duke jammers, those big rods that stick up. They're just in the way. So you kind of got to think about it a little bit. I tend to paint certain kinds of machine guns in place and some not in place. This is a good example. This roof-mounted machine gun is a hard mount to a painted mount that sits right here. Better to paint it in place. You're nice and solid. The one that's on the pintle mount, on a spin, it just sits up here. I just leave that off and paint it separately. That's easier. So again, it's a decision you make for every model based on what is easier to paint, in place or take it off. But most of the time, in place turns out to be a bit easier. Okay, any questions? Okay, so one thing that helps a lot, and this is where experience comes in, and I hope to jumpstart you guys a little bit, is to have a plan. Because what can happen if you're painting everything in place is you can really realize, crap, I've painted something that something else needs to be painted, so now I got to go back and paint it, or I've got to paint this, then this, then this. And so if you don't know what you're doing, the first few rounds will definitely take you longer as you start to get in your mind, how do I get this in an efficient pattern? Okay? For me, I always start with metals, tool, shovel blades, things like that, because I find that one, I almost always want to dry brush them with another metal, and two, there's usually something that attaches to them, such as either straps or the bracket, or they have wood handles, so they tend to need a multiple step paint job. I find that's usually the best to start with handle. That's usually followed by tow cables, because tow cables almost always need to have some kind of dry brushing of a metal color on them to get a good look. So I did on this model, and I did it for demonstration reasons, I painted basically a lot of stuff on this side is partly painted so I can demonstrate some weathering techniques, dry brushing and stuff like that. And this stuff is all, this side by and large, not painted at all. Just to give you an idea of what's there. Some things I painted in place because I kind of had to, but I wish I hadn't, such as the yellow tow bars. Those I had to mask completely. So those were a regret. Just had to do it. In this case, this one I didn't actually have to do. I wasn't thinking about it. And then this one I did because it was hard to mount the straps on later. So sometimes you pay the price. So I'll do a little demonstration of some metal work. I tend to use Model Master Metalizer metals for the metal work for a couple reasons. It's lacquer and it's really thin, but oddly, you'll get very good coverage with a brush. Those of you who use all-clad, if you do like airplanes a lot, all-clad for some reason, I don't think covers for a hill of beans. Metalizer, on the other hand, compared to say like just straight metals you buy, like the Tamiya metals or like the normal Model Master metal colors, this will look much more like real metal, I think, than the other metals, which are mostly either enamels or acrylics. I just don't think they paint well in enamels. Vallejo makes a nice line of metals, which I will confess to not having tried to brush paint yet. They're really thin for airbrushing, so I'm not sure how well they'll brush paint, but that would be an alternative. I just haven't tried it. So, things you really want to use. Really good optivisor glasses of some sort. So my normal prescription is like a 2, not much reading. These are 4.5s. And from 4.5, I can see pretty clearly about this far out. Okay, so call it a foot. For some of the real details, I'll switch to 6.0s. And I don't like optivisors because I find them very heavy. And the other problem with them is that they're right in front of your face, so you tend to want to, it's like hard to see. You get like this little, you kind of like clunk, you know. And just for me, I find, these are just reading glasses. You buy them on Amazon, they're dirt cheap. You get like a 5-pack for $15. So these are 6s. And anybody who wants to know what the vision range of a 6 is, you can try these afterwards. But for me, it's about here. But the nice thing about this is you can see everything crystal clear, really, really clear. And that's really important. So for painting, I'll start out with the dark metal, such as metalizer, exhaust. And they make them in both buffing and non-buffing, and I honestly don't know what the difference is because I've never used them for anything. I buffed one and didn't buff the other. I've never found it matters. So for brushes, here's my gigantic pile of brushes, which I was too lazy to figure out the ones I wanted to use, so I just brought the whole thing. You can use this super, super, super fine ones. Let's see if I have one. I don't even have one anymore, but like these little tiny ones, this is number 50. Yeah,
50.
They make 4 zeros, 5 zeros. I tend to stick with more medium size that have a bit of a point on them, because a lot of the brush work you do, you just need the point. Like this is a very good brush. It's not the thinnest brush, but the tip is pretty good. So you're not going to sit there and it's not like you're doing broad strokes on this stuff. You're just trying to get in there. And of course, if you're going to paint something larger, you're going to switch to a larger brush. But for the details, I'll start with this and make a demonstration. Okay, so I'm going to do just a few of these since you probably...
What size is that one?
That is number 40, Vallejo number 40. More and more of my brushes are whatever Henry has because I'm too lazy to figure out where else to buy brushes from. So my skills have adapted to Henry's brushes.
To say, as far as brushes, has anybody gone to Dick Blick in Fullerton?
To Dick Flick?
Yeah, it's called Blick, but it's Dick Blick. It's a.
Oh, I think it's a Dick Flick. I was going, no, I've never been to a Dick Flick in Fullerton. Damn, dude, this is a sharing. It's not like too much sharing.
For Wyland when they had a show on PBS, but they're in Fullerton off in Elwood. They have everything you need as far as brushes and stuff.
Okay.
Well, we got the art warehouse right over in Westminster.
Yeah, there's one in
too.
Westminster too. That's a good one too.
Oh, that's good. So another thing you really want is lighting. These things always work better when you have pretty good light on your situation. So a quick demo on how I do it. This part is probably the easiest part of it. You pray that the jar opens. I forgot the pliers again. So I spilled a few things here and there.
Where'd you get their light?
What's that?
Where'd you get that?
Actually, Micah was the one who found these things.
I've got one of those
It's called Natural Light by Daylight, and I don't love it, to be honest with you, but it's portable, which I like. So for painting,
supply place, but I
to
can't-
paint this, what I do is I'll get the paint on the brush, and I'll just, you'll look at it and you say, okay, I'm going to paint this this crowbar thing, and I'm just going to get the brush, I'm going to angle it so that the tip is going along the side I want to paint. So it's not coming down, it's not flat. So what you can do is you can usually get in there and just kind of run your brush, and those of you who are watching careful are probably noting by now that I'm getting nowhere near the whole thing in the paint. I'm not even coming close to the underside. But most of us, I hope, are using some kind of an oil wash afterwards, which is a very helpful thing. That's enough. Your eye is not going to see, especially with no accented vision, is not going to see underneath like that. And so to go under and make that effort is probably bigger risk of you painting the camo scheme by accident and getting a mistake than actually getting a better look. So I'm just going to paint this real quick, and I'll give you. And I'm doing it just to give you an example that when you get more experience, and I'm not going to lie to you, it takes a few rounds of this stuff, and like everything else, I recommend if you don't have something, take an old kit from your stash or an old built kit that you really don't want to keep anymore. Use it as a test mule, and do something like what I did, which is go out. If you have like say old Tamiya T34s, and maybe you have a whole bunch of tools and stuff that they've collected in the stash of spruce stuff that you never used over the years, glue it all on everywhere and just start experimenting with it. Don't ever pretend you're going to make a model out of it. Just use it for testing purposes. So as you can see, I'm just holding the brush and just running it. I usually pick up the model when I do it. A lot of people like to paint in place, like sitting it down. I find it very hard. By and large, I'll move the model as much as I move the brush. I find that to be a technique that's easier, especially for fine details. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple more tools, just to give you an example. So for shovels, again, you're running it along the strap, so you don't have to ruin the strap. And you just want to make sure you have enough paint on it, and it goes pretty quick. So you don't need to paint the underside of the shovel, because unless you have some kind of a shovel fetish that makes you want to sit there with a pen light and a number, and a 20.0 set of optic glasses that are like this, you're never seeing under there. No one's seeing under there. And I just, like I say, you can dip your brush in the jar of paint, which is something I do not recommend because you end up getting a ton of paint on your brush. I just use the cap, which almost always cocks up my paint pretty bad, but that's what pliers are for. And so for something like the shovel, which is bigger, the handle's bigger, I will roll the brush past the 90 degrees to try and get up under there. But it also sits high, so you can reach it pretty easily, so you can access it. And so that's it. So I'm not going to do more just because I don't want to take too much time. But I think the point I'm trying to make, and hopefully it was visible enough to see, is it's pretty fast. Not a terribly hard thing to do. And that's kind of going to be the story on a lot of this work. This is just lacquer thinner I'm cleaning the brush in. It's more a matter of practice, and if you bugger it, you can use a couple techniques if you get paint on the model. One of them is you can remember it's a tank, so just put more weathering on it. The second technique is a lot of times you go back and you can scrape it real quick with something like the end of a toothpick, something that's not super hard, like usually wood. And that usually, and a lot of times if I can't scrape it off, I'll smear it in. So as long as a dot is real visible, but a little smudge mark, it just kind of looks like part of the weathering. Okay, so that is the basic color, and I'll come back in a minute or two when it's dry to do some dry brushing. The next thing I said I typically paint are things like the tow cables. Same basic technique. I use a color. I'm just thinking I probably didn't bring it. I didn't. There's a couple colors you can use for tow cables depending on how you see them. One is a color called raw sienna, which Model Master makes. It's very much almost identical to me as flat earth. That's a good color for that rust. It looks like rust. It looks like earth. It's also a very good color to paint your tracks in for base color. If you want them a little more lighter, rusted out, say like a little deserty looking, you can use dark tan, which is, just a lighter tan. Or if you want something that looks a little heavier, deeper, I tend to like the Model Master's color is called Italian dark brown. Tamiya makes, I think it's just called dark brown. That's a perfectly good color. You can do that. And I think what I'll do for a demo is I'll do a little section in each of these so you can kind of see how it looks. And one of the things that's kind of cool if you start getting used to all this is you start realizing that things like cleaning your brush take time. So if you use the same kind of colors, so for example, I'll paint this one in the dark tan, and I'm just going to try and get, and now on something like a tow cable where you see it from the top, here you do want to go very slowly and carefully to try and get it as close as you can because you're looking straight down. And this one is just a little bit more careful, but again, this is where a long but pointy brush tends to help a lot. And you don't want a brush that's too small because what tends to happen is you kind of run out of paint very easily. And so you get a little bit what happens I find when I'm starting when I run out of paint very easily is I'll try to keep going even though the brush is kind of out of paint. And then you end up brush flicks and moves and stuff on you, and you kind of bugger it. So it's a big brush like this will hold a decent amount of paint, give you a few good strokes, and you can get done in a reasonably quick time, and you don't have to be super diligent, reminding yourself, okay, I'm out of paint, reload the brush. I tend to brush paint with enamels as much as possible, not because I think they paint better than acrylics, because I think they're pretty much the same, but the nice thing about enamels is you can leave them in the cap a lot longer. And so the paint does not start to dry out in the cap nearly as quickly as like Tamiya does. And so that means you're not doing this quite as often. And I just shake it up, put more. So I'll get a couple segments done here, and then I'll show you. So this is one option for tow cables. I tend to use this tow cable color here, which as you can see is pretty similar to that, a little bit darker. The raw sienna more than any color. And the reason is, again, I kind of paint knowing I'm going to put an oil wash on things. All right? So I know when I put an oil wash on, it's going to darken things. So if you start with something dark and you put an oil wash on it, it's going to get too dark and somewhat invisible, and you'll be like, oh, that doesn't even look right. But you can, on certain circumstances, say, I really kind of need this. And that's where like something like Italian dark brown works.
So you never
Can we
start
get
with
pliers?
like
Can I borrow some?
you never start like with a metallic.
No, I'll
silver
dry
or
brush.
anything like that.
I'll dry brush in the metals.
in
Yeah.
in a matrix.
Yeah, I'll dry brush in metals because I find that if you go all metal, it looks brand new, and something looks wrong. Even if you put a wash on it, it always has that metal, like brand new metal look to it. Thanks, Jimbo. Yeah, I kind of learned that the hard way because for a long time I'd paint them in different metal colors. And I'd be like, why is this just? It just and in armor, what I find is that metals, if they're real metally in any way, shape, or form, be it the end of your barrel, be it machine guns, be it tools, be it a metal piece on your own, if you have them bright, it really stands out because armor is supposed to be dull. It's got dust and dirt, and I may have to admit defeat on this jar of paint.
You have to go to lacquer thinner to get that out of there.
Hot water.
Yeah.
We'll let that go.
Tap it. Tap it.
Tap it, yeah.
You can try tapping, but you know.
Yeah.
That,
Flat.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think we're just gonna let it go and move on to the next subject.
Okay.
So in the end,
Otherwise, you're gonna
okay.
end up with all
Yeah.
these.
All right, so quick demonstration of some other colors. We're gonna let this dry a little bit, and I'll dry brush in just a minute. So a couple other things you can paint. Let's talk about stowage out here. So this is a tank that has as much stowage as I could possibly find. Some of it is by my doing, some of it was cast in place. So this is an area that's a very interesting demonstration section here, okay? Because the bin came as one big part. In order to fit the bin to the tank, which it wasn't designed for, because it's supposed to go in a striker, which has a flat side, I had a big old gap. So to hide the gap, I took what was basically a towel, like a rag, a dish rag, and I cut it little pieces and dipped it in scenic cement and shoved it in here like a tarp. So now I have got to paint the tarps, and then I got to paint the other stuff that's outside the tarp. So this is where sequencing makes a difference. So the first thing you want to paint is the tarp, because you want to make sure that these things get painted on top of the tarp. So tarps can be any color you want, basically. So what I do is I say, all right, what other colors am I going to use? And let's not use that color on the tarp, because the more different colors you get, the better it will look to your eye. You want to use, for the most part, what I'll call compatible colors. Tans go with greens, with browns, with some kind of grays, because the real ones are all probably originally started out the exact same color. You know, the Army just painted them in OD or whatever. But over time, they take on different looks because some absorb dirt more, some fade out more, some are used in different ways, etc., etc. So I'll paint this tarp. What I'm going to do, these jerry cans will be black. This thing's going to be, this bedroll typically is in a darkish gray a lot of times. This is a 20 millimeter ammo can, so that'll be an olive drab. That thing, I have no idea what it is, so I'm gonna save it till the end and pick a color I haven't used elsewhere. And this thing, I don't really know what that is either, but it'll probably be in some kind of a grayish thing as well. And this thing was supposed to be a pack, but the casting was poor, which is why it made it onto this tank, not a real model. And so I'm just gonna have to paint it some color and hope it doesn't look too bad when I get done. So for tarp color, I'm thinking grays, a darkish green, a black, light grays, some kind of anything I want. I'm gonna go with, say, khaki for a color for the tarp. Seems like a pretty neutral kind of, because, you know, when you paint, a lot of times you really don't want the tarp, for example, to be like the feature in that area. You know, the tarp is the background, and you got to think about it like that. It's like you're looking at a nice artist painting, right? Well, the Mona Lisa has some wonderful paintwork behind it, building with a window and a scene. How many people ever look at any of that? No, you're looking at the Mona Lisa. You look at the lady, right? So that's kind of what you want to think about. So you kind of want to think about that, because you don't want to bring to light something that's not your primary view, because your eye will see that and say, well, wait, something's up here. So this time, this lid did come off, thankfully. So this is Africa khaki brown, which is kind of a grayish khaki green. It's not really that green. It's got a lot of gray in it, and Tamiya doesn't make exactly this color, so it's not quite as good. There's not quite a good color in Tamiya for this, but their khaki would work perfectly fine here. Their khaki has a lot more brown in it. And again, for tarps and stuff like that, you just kind of shove your brush in. And the thing to remember is you want to make sure you get coverage, and you don't really care if you bump the packs that are going on top of it, because you're going to paint right over it. And that is your trick to getting this done pretty quick. And so, as you can see, I'm going rather fast, and I'm just going to cover what I can. And when you paint in place, it's also worth understanding that not everything has to be painted, you know, like some kind of an auto finish. If you don't get full coverage, no big deal. Washes are going in the crevices. The model is going to get is going to be dirty looking. So if there's a little bit of black underneath, you know, or a little bit of the base color, whatever it is, the greens or brown or grays, really doesn't matter that much. It really won't show. And so that the reason I say that is, it is easy to get absorbed in the idea of, I have to make this just a perfect paint job. And if you do, well, more power to you, but also be prepared to spend a lot more time. And so for me, it's like, all right, I want this to look khaki to my eye, and I'm pretty much good with khaki to my eye. And that's about all I really need. You know, I don't need somebody to sit there and go, well, that's a tarp produced in 1974 by the Army during a production run. Yeah, no, it's a tarp, man. That's all it is. It's just a tarp. Was what I'm saying make any sense as a logic? I mean, you know, and again, if you're a person who's okay spending a lot of time on your models and likes to spend hours and details, more power to you. I'm just super, super lazy, and I have like 1,000 different ideas in my head of model projects I want to do. So I spend, most of my techniques are designed around the idea of, I want to make the next model. And so I want to get this one done in a way I'm happy with, but not in a way that will take me, you know, 6 months to paint a simple model. I want to get this thing done in a way that generally for a model like this, I mean, this thing's really loaded. It would take, I don't know, 4 hours-ish. I usually can't do 4 hours in a row. I don't have 4 hours in a row, and I don't have patience for 4 hours in a row. So you do little pieces, do compatible colors, walk away, do something else for a while, come back. You can usually time it. So for example, like I would typically not paint the secondary items in here, the primary items, these pieces here. I wouldn't paint those right away. I'd probably leave those go so that this paint can dry out, you know. And I'd just be like, okay, there's other things to work on, like another kid or something, you know. Or,
So if you have multiple parts you're painting the same color, do you paint them all the same color at the same time? Or?
yes, oh yeah, absolutely. If I'm painting, I'll try and pick all the khaki I think I need, which is actually, it's a very good segue. How much I owe you for that? Because I was just going to lead into exactly that. But so I don't know how long I've been talking. 5 minutes about talking about tarps, roughly. Is that about right? What?
About that.
No, just about the tarp.
Yeah, right.
So in 5 minutes, I painted the whole tarp on. That one I cocked up a little bit. You can do, so that's one, I buggered that one because I should put my bear glasses on. So you can just wipe it. So a lot of times you can wipe it clean, you can't even tell. Okay. So John's question was, do you paint all the things that might be the same color at the same time? And I think, yeah, I'm lazy. I don't have to go find this color again. So what else might be this color? Well, I'll tell you what. I think this pack down here would look good in khaki. And what color should these packs be? Even in the real world, obviously this is just a made-up tank, but who knows? I mean, again, you don't know where that cat is. Is that a pack that just showed up, you know, from the depot? This brand spanking new that somebody sent in, or is that some guy's pack and he's, you know, this thing's been in the field for 5 years? So paint it something that looks like a reasonable field color for the unit you're working with. You know, I mean, you're not going to paint American packs in German gray and vice versa and all that, but. So yeah, I'm just gonna say, okay, good. I got a pack. That's good. I'm good. Moving on. Okay, so that's just some basics on on painting and logic processing for this type of thing. So now what I think I'll do is I'll take a little tact and I'll go, all right, let's do some dry brushing. So dry brushing for, as I showed in the first demo, for like an overall vehicle is one kind of dry brushing. Here you have a little bit of a challenge because if I want to dry brush, say, the tools or the tow cable, I really, really, really don't want to dry brush, say, the top of the model or the skirt, because, you know, that's going to look really up. So I'm going to dry brush. For tools, I'll usually dry brush off of the Model Master exhaust color. I'll usually use aluminum, but lightly, very lightly. For tow cables, I love this Model Master color, which is called dark anodonic gray. It's hard to really say what color you would call it. It's like a very dark aluminum color, maybe would be a good way to call it. It comes out even darker than this, and it's a little bit off in color from aluminum. It's not really like it's hard to say. You see this, it's similar to a titanium that's unprocessed, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a good color.
What was the name of it again? Dark?
Anodonic. Anodonic. It's a Model Master metalizer. Anodonic is ANDONIC.
Okay.
Dark anodonic gray. So you can get flat brushes of different sizes. So this is a good size, which is hard to find this brand. It's made, this is an Italeri brush, so it must not be that hard to find. So I have different size flat brushes that I use for dry brushing. And different lengths based on the stiffness. So some are more stiff, some are softer. I can't say I really think through why I want more or less stiff. I just kind of in my mind say, usually it's I'm trying to find a flat brush to dry brush with, and it's the first one I came to, if I'm honest. But for things like tools and stuff where the area is not very big, I'll probably pick a brush like this. Nice long brush, so you can get just the tip, and you can dry brush carefully, and it doesn't cover a whole big surface area, so you're not worried about like just nailed everything in one shot. Does that make sense? You guys kind of understand what I'm saying? All right, so quick dry brushing. So first I'm going to start with actually I'll start with the aluminum for the tools, and that way I can just go right into the gray, because that way I don't even have to clean the brush. I'll just switch from one to another. And for things like machine guns, I'll typically use the aluminum, because one of the things I've learned with dry brushing is that with washes, the metals will wash down heavily, very, very heavily. So even though aluminum on a machine gun may look a little awkward, it'll look fine after the wash. So to dry brush in metal, you hold the brush as flat as possible, and you kind of go along the surface, and I find that you don't want to be too heavy on the surface. And if you get a little on some of these buckles and stuff, that's fine. You probably can't tell. But I don't dry brush more than this. I'm not going to go in on the sides. I mean, you can say, oh, wow, let me get the fancy glasses on. You know, I really want to get like the edge of the mount point. I'm going to get that right in here, you know, I'm going to get way up in here. Aluminum versus the dry brushing. Here, it's bright right now, but this is going to get a flat coat and a wash, so it'll tone in. And because it's not solid, it's not perceived as being all aluminum. It's just got some shine to it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
One thing that I don't ever do is I never ever leave anything in bright metal on a tank when I'm done. A lot of people love that metal the edges and, you know, scrape the edges or look at metal, you know, okay. I don't love that look at all. For me, there's two reasons I don't love it. Number one is when everything else is flat and there's something shiny, it just looks weird to your eye. Number two, if you've been around real metal in the world, very rarely is it looking like metal. It takes, depending on the environment, as little as a day to flip over to get a little bit of a oxidation of some sort on it or rusting on it, and it just changes colors so fast. So having a bright piece of metal is like, I just scraped you, you know? So to me, that's a rare need, and I don't really do that much. I mean, you see that in aircraft, you see it a lot. I mean, you'll see struts that are plated, you know, and they stay beautiful, shiny metal all the time, and the whole engine cowlings and stuff, that's different. They look that way. But armor stuff tends to be, by and large, some derivative of steel, and steel will rust in a heartbeat. Okay, so now I'm going to do these tow cables. I'm using dark anodonic gray, and these, what I try to do with the tow cables is I try to be reasonably random with them, and it's a lot easier if you're using, you know, these tow cables are some ancient Italeri tow cable off like a leopard or something that was molded in the 70s and had a ridge line bigger than any of the tow cable lines and got scraped. And so you know, if you use the nicer tow cables you buy today, especially the real braided metal ones, you'll be able to dry brush and get beautiful detail. It just pops right out. And the ones that are actually braided, those, when you wash them, are really amazing because then the wash goes inside the braiding. But a lot of us don't have those available, or we're cheap and don't want to spend the money on them. So this technique, I find, will help quite a bit. So I'll finish the dry brushing, and here you can see the colors, it mixes. You don't see the dark anodonic as strongly as you do up on the tools. And the other thing is you don't see the uniformity of the dry brush. So hopefully what you're catching is some, you know, I purposely left like a segment, let me see if I can point it out. Like down here, this whole segment down here is not heavily dry brushed at all. Now it's not like I, in my mind, had a layout, a schematic, and said, okay, dry brush. My eye just went, okay, make sure it's random, try not to be uniform, and just kind of went along and said, okay, uniform, not uniform. And you kind of get that look naturally, and it's a little bit of a practice job, but after the experience comes, it just kind of goes with it, like I did. You know, 1 minute and the thing was dry brushed. So that's the basics of painting things in place. So a little bit more on dry brushing, or actually, that's basics of metal work, rather, sorry. A little bit more on dry brushing. So up top here, I gotta use the other glasses so I can't see. And that is something I do all the time. I'll switch glasses like crazy. So up top, you see some stuff that needs to be dry brushed. Some more than others, but you know, these need to be dry brushed. So for here, when you gotta dry brush something, I tend to use tan color. Like, where did it go? Here. This is my all-time favorite color, which you can't even read because you can see how long I've had this jar. Paint's gone everywhere in it. It's a Model Master color, which thankfully they still make, called Africa Dunkelgrau. Dunkelgrau means gray tan, essentially, right? That's
Gray.
Dark gray.
Yeah, it's not really dark gray though. It's more of it's like a beige with a lot of gray in it, and I find it to be absolutely compatible with all forms of browns, greens, anything in earth colors. And I have two versions of this. I have the basic one that comes, and then I have the lightened version where I just poured a bunch of white in it, so you can see. And that's just really a matter of what am I going against, because you want to make sure your dry brush has got enough contrast to it. And once again, with dry brushing, you want to make sure you have enough contrast in the dry brush so that when you put an oil wash on it later, it doesn't go away completely. So you get the basic tenets of, and when I say oil wash, I think I said this last time, today the word would be filter, where you just cover the whole model, not going around it in detail. You're just covering the whole model with a big brush and get it all over and then taking it back off. The basic fundamentals of that is that the lighter it is, the more it's going to stain. So you need to know that ahead of time. So you can take advantage of that by using a very light dry brush, stain that into the darker greens or browns, whatever you're using. So I will typically dry brush things like packs with a big brush. And the reason is I don't want to get in the nooks and crannies very easily. So chances of this opening are oddly good. that jar should not have opened so easily. But so with a big brush, again, with dry brushing, you want to make sure it's pretty dry. I tend to dry brush wetter than most people.
Yeah, I can tell.
Because I just feel that you want the sloppiness of the wet brush. That's my opinion. When you get real dry, what happens is you pull out a very precise results. And I think, if you're dry brushing something, say like in an aircraft, where you're trying to dry brush specific things, like say the struts on a landing gear, you want to be pretty dry. You want to be pretty uniform. In armor, the less uniform you are, generally speaking, the more appealing it will look to your eye, because you're expecting it to look like a tank. You're expecting it to have that clunky kind of beat up look that vehicles get, no matter what you do to them, And so for dry brushing here, you can see this is almost like stabbing at it because I get around stuff, but what you kind of see is that it kind of picks out, so that should kind of pick out the details of that little piece of green. Other places you got to dry brush a little bit differently, like these ammo cans that are mounted off the back rack here. Those I don't want to do that because they're not soft packed; they're hard, they're metal. So there, it's back to it's edge dry brushing like this, where you just very gently catch it, and for the top surface, you can go along the top surface and pick up some detail. You just want to be a little bit gentle because you don't want to get a big smear. But I also feel that it's okay to get a little bit on the regular surface, and the reason is the real cans or whatever, they'll start picking up color contrast over time. They're not going to keep, you guys have all been to like the old Army Navy stores where you see these things and they don't look like one color of green anymore. So this is kind of a quick and easy way to do that versus, I've seen some techniques online where the guy goes in and he's painted 16 colors olive drab in different shades and he's weathered it 4 different times and he's done the oil dots, and it's like, it's a freaking ammo can, man. I don't have that kind of time, It's like, I don't have, honestly, you can go to town if you want, but and these are, for me, I call this the modeling for dummies technique, but this is what I use. Every model you've seen, I've used them on, but this is like modeling for dummies, because you don't want to. I'm like, come on, I don't have all day, It's actually, and so you can do this, and I'll just do this pack back here. So for like something like this, which I really needed to paint out, but you can actually cheat. So, for example, say you got to the point where you realize, oh, I should have painted this thing, but I didn't. This one you really should have. You can actually dry brush out a lot of painting mistakes. So here, I'm going to dry brush this thing pretty thoroughly. And what you're going to see is a really odd effect that a lot of the painting problems. So let's look at this. Here you can see the gray overspray, right? So normally I would say go in and paint this thing a color you want it to be. But just to show you the technique, I'm going to dry brush this
Pretty wet.
with a pretty wet brush. Yeah, it's not super dry. It's not like the ultra dry brush. But on one side of this model is a lot of black, which is a very common problem. Is you'll forget to, especially if you're trying to airbrush stuff, you'll forget to paint out the base color. You're like, oh crap, this whole section needed painting. But I'm going to decide that this model, because I'm in a hurry and I don't want to deal with it, I'm going to dry brush with a wetter than normal brush. And what I'm essentially doing is blending out the colors. And again, I'm not claiming this is a good idea, but this is I need to fix this, and I don't want, and I really don't want to go back and repaint. I don't want to mask it, and I'm just, I want this thing to be finished. And so now I've painted this, and even though I had a rather large amount of gray overspray on it and black overspray on it, it kind of blended in, and you put oil wash in there, what's going to blend more, you can kind of get away with that. It's a cheat. Don't do it if you don't have to, but if you do and you really don't want to deal with it, cheat. I'd say cheat.
Are you dry brushing all the top details on that chart?
What do you mean? All the stowage stuff?
Yeah.
Eventually, yeah. When I get them all done, yeah, absolutely.
So you're gonna paint each one individually, then go back and dry brush
Yeah,
every one of them?
yeah. And it's a lot quicker to paint in place because, like, for example, this is a really good example. This is an Israeli-style ammo can rack. They put a big old rack and put a strap across a whole bunch of ammo cans. Could you imagine how much time and effort you'd have to put in to painting 5 50 cal ammo cans, all OD, all on like toothpicks to spray them. Then you got to dry brush each one of them. Got to glue them all in place. Yikes, be there for a while, man. Okay, one more thing on dry brushing, which is, let's talk about tracks. So, for tracks, I would dry brush with that raw sienna, but since I forgot to bring that, I'll go back to the dark tan. So, when you paint a track in place, you know, tracks by and large come in base color. There are basically two base colors you'll use. Black, when it's a more modern track that started out black, and like that's M1 Abrams, M60s, you know, all those tracks that are modern tracks, they usually come out painted black from the factory and they wear out almost immediately into some other color, usually a rusty color. But it's not bad to start with them in black because you can leave the pads to a large extent as an easy base. But you want to pick up something other than all black, because otherwise it looks like some kind of a brand spanking new track. It looks weird. I tend to dry brush tracks in that color in a couple, in a raw sienna, dark tan color first, and then some metal to show where it's got scraped. The other tracks that you see very commonly are, call them solid metal tracks, T55 tracks, very good example. T34s, all those tracks. They came in just in metal. They're usually painted in some kind of primer when they're there, but within moments the things are metalled. And other than in a very rare moment where they're pure metal, I did see one tank that was doing all kinds of beach operations that the thing was like polished steel.
Yeah.
It was up on a tray, it was on a flatbed. It was like, what the hell? I mean, literally it looked like somebody had buffed it out. But normally what you see is they take on the same color as they're a combination of rust and dirt, because that's what's on them. So you paint them in a dirty rust color, and then you just go straight to metals for dry brushing. But in this tank, since it started out as a blackish kind of track and it's got the pads, I painted the tracks black, and you can see the dry brushing I did. So you dry brush first, and this one's really easy to dry brush because you just go in and just run it. And the beauty of painting in place is this is the limit of the dry brushing I'm going to do on these tracks. I'm just going to go to about here. I'm not going to go down here. Now I am going to go, as I get a little further, I am going to go from the inside. I'll go on the inside the whole way. Oops, I said it's too wet. If it's a little wet, you can undry brush with your finger. That works good. So I'm going to go like this, and I'm just going to get the ends so that you can tell something's there. If you're doing tracks like these that are rubber bands, you have to be just a little careful because you tend to dry brush, you'll pick up the little mold line. You can either accept it and incorporate it in, or just be bummed about it. But there's
So
not much you can
you
do.
basically paint the track all black.
I paint it whatever the base color of the tank is, or the bottom part of the vehicle. So a lot of times, the bottom part of the vehicle, I'll paint in brown because I'm like, the whole thing's going to be dusty and dirty. And so then the tracks end up that color, or the tracks end up black, depending on how I want to start.
So to do
Especially World War II era stuff, I usually just paint from here down brown.
So the end connectors are kind of just dry brushed with that Dunkelgelb stuff.
No, with dark tan or raw sienna, a little darker colors. So this is just a quick idea of how I dry brush on the outside of a track, and it's really just a way of how do you pick up some details. And so you can run right down the center, which are the center pin pieces. There's usually a little double pin piece that goes through there, and then for the if you look for the upper surface or the road wheel contact surface, you know, you kind of want to get the end connectors and maybe the area maybe in here, but after that it doesn't really matter that much because you can't really see it, and you're going to usually, as you're finishing your model, one of the last things that I do a lot of, and I recommend it highly, is I will use some pigments down here to show the dustiness, and that will blend out almost everything, so you don't really need to put a lot of time into this. You guys have often heard me say, if tracks are the highlight of your tank, you've got a problem, because tracks are low, they're down below, and they're not the thing that people are supposed to be looking at on your tank. They're just not. You're supposed to be looking at stuff up here. If you're down, if somebody's telling you how great your tracks look, true or not, it means they didn't think how great everything else you had looked. And I'm not trying to be like super negative on this. I'm just saying you got to ask yourself, why do they see my tracks more than anything else? You know. So tracks how do you do these tracks to make them reasonably good without taking forever? Yes.
What about road wheels, Jimmy, with rubber on the
I don't do anything about them. I paint them. I try not to overspray them. Whatever overspray, like the last time, this were painted black originally, then I painted in the grays, and I dry brushed them and there's overspray, but by the time you spray a little, either some buff or some brown to seem like dust, and you put a wash on it, and then you put pigments on it, if you go in and edge these out nice and carefully, By the time you're done, they're gonna look just like this, and you're like, that was a whole lot of time. Which is why I mount all my road wheels ahead of time and my tracks, because I realize I don't really need to paint these that carefully. I'll usually paint them black, initially, so that when I get done all the various airbrushing, there's still black areas showing through the contact surface. They'll look a little black. But even then, by the time you're done with all the weathering, they'll look great. I could tell you right now that like I did not paint out the road wheels on the diorama tanks. Those weren't those were probably painted initially, but weathered out with the airbrushing on overspray. Just not worth it. The time you spend painting all that is not worth it. You can paint road wheels in place with tracks on. I've done it. Every once in a while, there's a reason to do it. It's not that hard. It's the same thing as what I was showing you with the small brush. It just takes a while. There's a shitload of them.
Yes.
And so, yawn, I don't want to spend that much time. And I almost always decide to do it because I have not, usually what happens is after about 20 or 30 tanks, I'll decide, I should really paint these road wheels out. I probably should do that again. And I'll do it. I get done, I go, that was a complete waste of time. Why didn't I just do what I always do? I'm always mad at myself for it. It's always like I just wasted my time. I'm like, Okay, so you paint it. So you paint them first in a brownish color, and then I usually go back with the dark anodonic gray I was telling you about. And I'll dry brush them again with the dark anodonic to pick out that sort of scraping, the little bit of metal you see. So let's see, this is the side, I think this is the side. And here I go a lot lighter because I don't want to pick it out too much. And sometimes you'll do it and you'll realize, this dark anodonic's not coming out much. So I'm gonna switch to aluminum. This is an eyeball deal. You just gotta decide what's popping. In this case, the reason the dark anodonic isn't working is that these are Heller tracks from the early 90s, and the surface detail is so low that there's not enough detail to pick out, so I'm going to use a stronger color to get something. Yeah, this is an old Heller kit from the 90s. It's a poor representation of a Leclerc prototype, and the tracks are rubber band tracks that are sitting, that there must be 20, 25 coats of paint on these things with all the demos I've done on it.
You're going back over your ground.
Yeah. So what happens is you go back over the brown a little bit, but it doesn't take out all the brown. So now you've got a combination of brown and silver. And again, this is not me doing this quick to get done. This is how I normally do it. You go about this fast. And you can hide it if you buggered a section, you missed a section like I forgot to do in here. Oh well, I'll just do silver. It won't be that big a deal. If you've hit maximum laziness, you can just throw the silver on in and okay, so now I've kind of metallized them. The one thing I do try to do is I'll try to get a smaller dry brush, like maybe this guy, and I'll try to get the guide horns, because those do kind of pop out a little bit, and it is kind of nice to see something on the guide horns. So for these, you just kind of stick your brush in there and just run them across one time. Maybe back and forth at most. And you really don't want the guide horns. You don't want the guide horns to get solid metal, because then it looks like you hand painted them and it doesn't look right. But since it's in place, you can only reach some of them, but then again, you can only see some of them. We'll call that a fair trade.
Oh, there's cookies.
And voila, in 10 minutes or so, I've got all the dry brushing done on this thing. So then the last thing, as I was saying, is you generally want to go back and pick up the pads. You don't have to, but what I find out with tank tracks, with tracks that have pads, it's kind of good to get the pads to a uniform color before you start your weathering, because in particular, the pigments will tend to smear into the color. So if you have like a blended out like this already, and you put the pigments in there, then it stays really blended out. But what looks a little nicer is you put the pigments in on a solid pad and you rub them with your thumb, and then the pads will pop out, because that's what's running on, particularly running on things like roads. So you kind of want to do that. So for pads, I will use a dark gray. You can use to me a dark gray if you want to go in acrylic, or you can use something like gunship gray, which unfortunately the colors I used to like, Model Master used to make a great color called U.S. Army Helo Drab, but they don't make it anymore, so now I have to improvise. So we'll try dark gray. And with pads, you don't have to use a particularly small brush at all, because it doesn't really matter if you get it exactly right. You just want to get it close to right. But has anyone ever done pads where they painted out each pad on a track? Has anyone done that? Have you guys done that?
Dry brush the pads.
Okay, so no one's actually just sat there and painted an entire pad on a track, huh?
Yeah.
If you have, how long did it take you when you did the whole track?
I didn't do the whole track, just the ones that were visible.
Okay, so if you've ever done
Like
it,
a Abrams or something, you just
Yeah.
do the front,
like I'm doing,
yeah.
but has anyone ever done it where they had like workable tracks that were off the vehicle and painted the pads? It takes forever. It's a good hour per track, you know, if you gotta do the whole run. Cause there's a lot of them, right? You know, but here, this one, you just need the exposed, and the thing to understand with track pads is you only want the exposed part of the pad, you don't need the edges at all. Cause you're gonna shove washes and dust or washes and pigments and everything in there. So, you know, you can do an entire set of pads down to the first, basically you wanna get to the first road wheel where the surface goes flat. You know, and my choice of brush is almost always the brush that can hold at least a full pad's worth of paint, preferably 2 pads worth of paint. And that is, so for this tank, that's the front end. Oh, I have probably one more set. So that is the front end of the tank. So that's it. What was that, 5 minutes max? So 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, not even. Truly, it's about 15 minutes, and you're gone. If you've ever tried painting these, there used to be techniques I used to use to paint. When I had to paint the whole thing, I used to paint a whole swath down there and run it, you know, and run the track on it so it's too lazy. Because it'd take you an hour an hour per run if you did it off the track.
Put it in the bathroom.
I used to paint a stretch of paint like this on a piece of like
Yeah.
the
Linoleum or something.
linoleum or something, and then just run the track
Right,
along it to
yeah.
pick it up. And then I realized this is so there. I'm done. You know, so that's tracks, and that gives you an idea of the basic stuff you can do on your kits. And I wasn't really thinking I'd spend a lot more time on demo work, just because I know it's gotten late and we had other demos and stuff. So at this point, I thought I would actually open it up for questions if anyone's got questions related to any of this stuff.
Your washes, doesn't that affect the oil paints?
So the next step, once you've got all this stuff painted, I'm gonna demonstrate one more thing actually. Well, I don't need to, but sorry. The other thing that is a little bit complicated are straps. The answer to your question, Jim, is I always put a dull coat over my model before I put an oil wash on it.
And the Mona Lisa doesn't affect
The
that?
Mona Lisa really doesn't affect anything. But if you put I use Tesser's dull coat in an airbrush, that's a beautiful barrier. It also, the flatness of it lets it absorb into lets the oil wash absorb into the paint really well. And that'll be another demo for maybe next year. And the really great thing about that is smoothly as you think you've painted it, if you put a flat coat under a microscope, you know, gloss coat looks flat. It looks like a smooth line under a microscope. But the surface texture of a flat coat is jagged, but it's not uniform at all. The beauty of an oil wash is it goes in different levels into the texture, and your paint will get a modeling look to it. Not modeling, look to it, and so will all your stowage. And another reason to keep your stowage on your model, in particular your stowage on your model when you paint it, and painting in place like this, is when you wash, you almost always want to wash the model with the stowage in place. You never want to wash your stowage separately, because what happens is when you glue it on, it may not look compatible with the model. It'll get a different look to it. Whereas if you put the wash together, it blends the stowage into the model, which is what's happening in the real world. The stuff's sitting on the back of your tank. It's getting the same dirt, the same dust, the same rain on it. So that last step, whether you paint separately or together, like for example, when I go to do the oil wash on this model, I will put these extra pieces on as much as possible before I put the washes on it, so that it all blends in with the model. So I could demonstrate painting straps. It's pretty much the same thing as painting tools and stuff. You just kind of go one at a time and go slow, and go into buckles. You may or may not paint. Sometimes you don't need to. A lot of times buckles are just as easy to leave the same color as the strap and let the oil wash pick it out.
If that model didn't have the side skirts on it, how would you paint the top rungs of the tracks?
Exact same way. No
Just
different.
paint the edges?
if it had the pads and you could see the pads, and I'd get it as best as I could with the brush. And my logic would be is if I can't reach it with the brush, you can't see it. And I try to remind myself that a lot of the upper surface, even without the skirts, is still going to be covered in pigments and dust. And so it really doesn't need to be painted out that clearly, because you still have the physical dimensionality of the pads. You can still see it physically. So if you went in and tried to paint it carefully, you'd be, whatever. But some things I'm a little more careful. So for example, like tiger tanks, where there's a big droop and you see it, and it's a real big gap to the sponsons. Yeah, I'll go in and I'll make sure that the upper surface is reasonably brown, not perfect, but reasonably. And I'll definitely dry brush with metals, to get the links to show up. And I'll try to remind myself that if I get the brush too far and I touch some metal to the inside of the hull, not a big deal, because you can go back with some thinned out dark earth from Tamiya and an airbrush in there, or you can just pigment over it and hide it, and the metal kind of goes away. So
what color might your straps be?
Well-
How do you contrast that?
generally, what I do is, let me demonstrate one real quick. I'll generally use the same color of these Africa Dunkelgrau for straps that are in a color that's similar to it, such as browns and greens and tans. And the reason is, in the real vehicles, real packs and stuff, you've probably all had duffel bags or something, they're pretty much the same material. So the only reason you paint a strap a different color is you kind of want to make the strap like, hello world, this is a strap. Otherwise it's too similar and you don't see it. So you want something that's going to end up compatible. And I will pick colors that I think are going to be visible, but not like shining beacons of strap, I mean, occasionally straps are something different. Sometimes they're leather, so you put in browns, or sometimes, that wasn't very helpful. Sometimes they're black, or like those, the more modern straps are usually made out of all kinds of interesting fabric material. So they're actually different colors. Some are in gray and whatnot. This is a big brush. Yeah, so for a strap, again, it's a small brush, powerful glasses, and, occasionally, once you do it enough, you start to get an idea that like this pack here, which isn't painted, but I use it as here, I'll do, these guys are painted. So this side pack is painted, and I want to paint these straps here in this Africa Dunkelgrau. And I'm just going to run them along. And I'm going to try to tell myself, one, what I want more than anything is to not have it go onto the tarp, onto the bedroll, or whatever that is, the rolled up tarp. And two, I want to keep it as uniform as possible so that the straightness of a strap pops out. So you just kind of drag the brush. It's a lot like painting tools and stuff. But you can also sort of say, okay, so I have these straps here, which I'll only just do these two. So I'm doing these guys in the Dunkelgrau. But next to it are other straps, right? Next to it are these straps. Well, those straps are not part of the tarp itself. Those are the straps that the troops, the crew has strapped around the tarp to hold it onto the vehicle. So for those, I'm going to go something similar but different to say, hey, I'm a different strap. And in this case, I'll just use a lighter version of that. That's an easy enough way to go. So here, this is lighter. So this one I'm just going to paint. And again, for something like these buckles on here, knowing that this is a modern tank, a lot of the buckles you see today are plastic. They're injection molded plastic. So they're just black. Think like the buckle on your car seats. So I will often go back and paint those too in black to pop out. And occasionally, depending on how distinct they are, those I may even dry brush the flat black with some like a dark gray to pop out the buckle a little more, depending on how much I really want to highlight them. Okay. So for straps, as I showed you, it's just really a matter of patience, and you don't need to have the steadiest hand. If you look at my hand, it's sort of steady. But it helps to have a brush that's notably different size than this thing you're trying to paint. You don't want to have like a big brush on a little part. But what you can see with the straps is that they're different enough colors to identify them as straps of different application. Is that understandable what I'm saying? So the logic here being that your eye will now say, oh, those are the straps holding everything on. These are the straps, these are the straps that held everything on, and these are the straps for the tarp itself. So,
So, just like, what are the next steps in your weathering process now that you've finished like
Afraid to touch it.
all your detail painting and your dry brushing? Where do you go from here?
Thanks, Jimmy.
so I think I'm actually gonna do a demo next year. I talked to John about some of that. But the basics of what I do next are, you get everything painted, 100% done. Dull coat, at least one round. You wanna make sure the model is pretty much flat and dull. The next thing I do after that is I use an oil wash, or an oil filter. For me, 99% of the time, I use a Winsor Newton color called raw umber. It's a brown, black, gray kind of color. It's a neutrally thing. There are other ones like raw sienna, which has got kind of reds in it. I just think it's a little too distinct. The raw umber is just a neutral color. It's great for all armory things. It's got a dirty look to it. It kind of looks like grease in some ways, which is also what you can make grease stains out of in a thicker tone. I'll use it, I'll put it on, smear the whole thing on, let it dry. Unlike in airplanes where you may go in with panel lines and pick out the line itself, I don't like to do that in armor. A lot of people do. You'll see that in a lot of the demo books where they'll go in and they'll pull out all the panel lines. To me, armor needs to be blended in more. Airplanes, you want the panel lines because you want to know there are actual panels there. Your armor should be a merge. I get done with that, then another flat coat, and then, well, actually after the oil wash, depending on what I want the look to look, I will usually go in with some buff or some flat earth from Tamiya, or flat earth, and I'll kind of get the bottom browned up with the sides a little dusty. Sometimes I go in right on the surface and lighten areas up to get a bit of a fading. And depending on how I like the look to be, I may decide, oh, I would like to do this before the wash, knowing that it'll blend it together more, or I'll do it after the wash because I wanted to bring it out more, because the buff will be a little stark, and that can look really good if you're trying to simulate dust. But it can also be used as a way to show, give like the imagery of fading. So you say, oh, I wanted something to look a little faded, then you do that before the wash. And sometimes you do both. You go, I'm gonna fade a little bit, I'm gonna wash it in, and you go, oh, okay, that blended in too much. More buff, fix it. And if you're doing a vehicle that's out in the desert more, sometimes the buff is a little too dark, and you go to switch to me, a deck tan, depending on your terrain you're playing on.
Diluted?
What's that?
Are you using those?
Yeah, I think I did that demo in January, I about 60, 70, 80% dilution, pretty heavy dilution, and you just go in layers. Otherwise, you're just gonna paint it, you know. And then somewhere in there is another flat coat or two, and then usually I finish with pigments. And at the end of the pigments, I'll usually dry brush with a dark color, typically black, sometimes dark brown, to look like the scraping areas and the dirty areas, like, you know. And then I tend to be, that one, I have to do that demo more to be more clear about it, but that area, that tends to be very non-uniform dry brushing, so it's like you are thinking about, okay, where would people typically walk? Or a boot would scrape on it, or things are being dragged on the vehicle. So that's, you know, so every time there's like a corner of some sort, you drag it on paint, you know what happens, it scrapes. It doesn't like chip and ding. I tend to be pretty careful with chipping personally. I don't chip a lot. I really,
Not on American equipment.
the original logic that, you didn't see a lot of chipping until Mig did a whole thing on chipping. And if you read his really, really early articles, I think some of them are still available on Missing Links. I think is when he first started publishing before he got famous. He was just trying to get famous. He talked a lot about his inspiration was to look at construction vehicles and use them as means, as a way to weather his armor. Which I get the analogy, but I also think he's wrong, because construction vehicles are used 24/7 if possible. They are out there, they're rarely taken care of, and they just don't look, you know, armor just doesn't look that way. Even the worst armor you see photos of, or those of you who've been on them, they just don't get utterly decrepit. They get blown up a lot. But.
In Zaloga's book, he was saying that by the time a Sherman got to Normandy, usually it had been spayed olive grab up to 5 times.
Yeah, well,
And
then
American paint, as you already know, is probably the best in the world.
you know, Shermans, when I did the research years ago, you can see Shermans that look like they just came from the factory, loaded with stowage and mud. You can see Shermans that are 3 years old that somehow or another were like fought in. I mean, there literally was a great photo of a Sherman at the end of the war in Italy, in northern Italy, in a pool of like 50 Shermans. And here are all these modern 76mm Shermans or late M4A3s, and it's just one direct bore DV that that they actually traced it later on in the series. They traced the thing. It actually landed in Morocco and somehow survived the whole freaking war. It was just like, hi, I'm your grandpa. I'm still fighting. You know, it was really, and so that looked oddly different. You could tell it had been through the ringer. You know, so some were like that. But you're right. To me, more typical armor. Well, Allied armor in World War II is generally not used for very long. If you really think about it, 6 months to a year, and modern armor is painted with some extremely careful paint requirements. I mean, very, very high-tech coatings, designed not to fade too much, designed not to chip by far. And not only that, but the guys I know, other than Louis, who didn't take care of his tank, most of the guys I know in the Army said that the Army in particular was extremely, extremely specific about, you will keep this thing in good shape. They were not letting you, I mean, so I'm not saying they're immaculate and beautiful.
Put it in the motor pool once it was clean.
Yeah, but a lot of things too that I find with weathering, when I've looked at it carefully, a lot of what people think as weathering in the form of chipping and dirt and stuff is actually dirt with the original color showing through. So you'll see a tank that looks like it's got like lots of chipping on the edges and stuff. And what it is, it's actually a layer of dust that's diminished the color of the tank, and then what you see that's dark is actually the regular paint color. And if I've said this many times, if you haven't looked at how dirty tanks get, there's a photo of a Sherman in Italy somewhere that is a tan Sherman. It's not a tan Sherman. It's an olive drab Sherman that's just so covered in dust. And in modern day, if you go look at photos of particularly the Canadian LAVs, and they're the best example. There are pictures of the 8-wheeled LAVs in Afghanistan that literally look like somebody painted them in tan, like this color tan. And I'll tell you right now, every Canadian LAV was an olive drab, or their version of olive drab. That's just how they got uniformly dirty like that. But as soon as you start touching them, that dust layer goes away, and there's the green underneath. And people, in particular with World War II, I think were looking at black and white photos and not realizing that that's what they were looking at. They were thinking they were looking at the basic paint with this dark areas that must be chipping and scraping when it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's just my philosophy on this.
Plus, and I currently have seen current builds by several modelers on Facebook that their effort, especially where chipping and weathering is concerned, it's to be applauded.
Yeah, oh God, yeah.
But quite literally, those tanks didn't live long enough to get that distress.
You can always do Syrian and Taliban tanks, those are pretty beat up.
Yeah, you're right.
What side you fought on in the war, your tank did not live long enough to get that.
Or you
I mean, 99% of the time I agree with you. I also agree with Kevin. If you look at pictures of the Syrian tank in modern Syria, yeah, they look, or like the old Taliban and Northern Alliance tanks in Afghanistan. Yeah, they do look like something out of a bad movie. But that's specific. Yeah. When I see pictures, I've seen wonderful model builds, like you say, just dramatic and beautiful, of Israeli armor that has this worn out, weathered, dirty. Have you taken any photos of an Israeli armor piece? Not at all. I mean, the Israeli armor, they're immaculate tanks. Yeah, their tanks look beautiful. In the field they'll get dirty, but you just don't see them chipped out. But you see these pictures.
But we had a wash rack with 6, like you're saying, the crew was required to wash them, to row after row after row in the desert. By the time you got it washed off and drove back to where you were supposed to park in the first place, it looked just like it did before you put it on the wash rack.
But you check.
That's because you didn't have anybody drying it.
They just wanted to keep you humping so you forget about drinking and women.
So any other questions or anything, guys? I'm gonna let this wrap up so we don't shoot got show and tell. Yes. Thank you all.
There's a difference between like in the morning.
I just do it whenever I'm doing it. It doesn't matter to me. I just paint day, night, whenever.
It doesn't matter.
Not at all. Makes no difference.
Even the light you sit back to do the painting.
Well, I have real lights at home,
Or like
No, I have